The stars were not kind to those who dreamed of them. They were cold, distant, and indifferent, much like the people who lived beneath them. But a 14-year-old Kaela Veyra, the stars were not just distant lights. They were a promise, a calling, a destiny she could not ignore. Even as the other children mocked her for her tattered clothes and her too big dreams, Kaela would lie on the rusted rooftop of her family's crumbling hab unit, staring up at the sky. She would trace the constellations with her finger, imagining herself soaring among them, free from the gravity of her life, on the forgotten colony of Eridanus 7. Eridanus 7 was a place where dreams went to die. A backwater colony on the edge of the Galactic Federation. It was a world of dust storms, decaying infrastructure, and people who had long since given up on the idea of a better future. Kaela's parents were among them. Her father, a broken-down mechanic who spent his days tinkering with obsolete machinery. Her mother, a seamstress who stitched together uniforms for the few remaining miners who hadn't yet fled the planet. They loved her in their own way, but they couldn't understand her. To them, the stars were just another reminder of how far they had fallen. But Kaela was different. She had always been different. From the moment she could walk, she had been drawn to anything that flew. Model ships, drones, even the scavenger birds that circled the colony's waste dumps. By the time she was 10, she had taught herself to pilot a hoverbike, using parts she had scavenged from the junkyard. By 12, she had built her own simulator out of salvage tech, teaching herself the basics of Starship navigation. And now, at 14, she had applied to the Galactic Academy of Pilots, the most prestigious training institution in the Federation. It was a long shot. Eridanus 7 hadn't sent a candidate to the Academy in over a decade, but Kaela didn't care. She had to try. The day the rejection letter arrived, Kaela was in the middle of repairing a malfunctioning thruster on her hoverbike. Her hands were slick with grease, her hair tied back in a messy braid, and her face smudged with dirt. She didn't hear the delivery drone at first, its soft hum drowned out by the clatter of tools. But when she finally noticed it hovering outside the window, her heart skipped a beat. She wiped her hands on her overalls and reached for the letter, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal. The words were brief and impersonal. "We regret to inform you that your application has been denied." The Galactic Academy of Pilots receives thousands of applications each year, and we are unable to accept all qualified candidates. We encourage you to pursue other opportunities. Kaela read the letter 3 times, as if hoping the words would change. But they didn't. She felt a lump rise in her throat, but she refused to cry. Crying was for people who gave up, and Kaela Veyra was not a quitter. She crumpled the letter in her fist and tossed it into the corner, where it joined a growing pile of discarded dreams. That night, as she lay on the rooftop staring up at the stars, Kaela made a decision. If the Academy wouldn't take her, she would find another way. She didn't know how yet, but she would. The stars had called her, and she would answer, no matter what it took. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 days later, a sleek Federation transport ship landed in the colony spaceport, its hull gleaming under the pale light of Eridanus 7's sun. Kaela heard the news from her father, who had been called in to help with the repairs. "It's a recruitment vessel," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They're looking for cadets. Apparently, there's some kind of emergency. They need pilots, and they're not being picky." Kaela's heart raced. This was her chance. She didn't know what kind of emergency would make the Federation lower its standards, but she didn't care. She grabbed her jacket and ran to the spaceport, her mind buzzing with possibilities. The recruitment officer was a tall, stern-looking woman with silver hair and a sharp gaze. She looked Kaela up and down, taking in her patched clothes and grease-stained hands. "You're younger than most of our applicants," she said, her voice cool and measured. "And you're from Eridanus 7. Not exactly a hub of talent." Kaela straightened her shoulders and met the woman's gaze. "I can fly anything," she said, her voice steady. And I'm not afraid of hard work." The officer raised an eyebrow, then handed her a datapad. "Prove it." The test was a simulation, a high-speed obstacle course through an asteroid field. Kaela's hands flew over the controls, her instincts taking over. She weaved through the rocks with ease, her movements precise and confident. When she finished, the officer stared at her in silence for a long moment. "You're raw," she said finally, "but you've got potential. Report to the ship at dawn. And don't be late." Kaela nodded, her heart pounding with excitement. As she walked home, the stars seemed brighter than ever, their light guiding her toward a future she had only dared to dream of. The Galactic Academy of Pilots was nothing like Kaela had imagined. She had pictured gleaming halls, bustling with cadets in crisp uniforms, their faces alight with the promise of adventure. Instead, she found herself in a cold, sterile environment where every surface seemed to hum with quiet hostility. The Academy was a fortress of glass and steel, perched on the edge of a sprawling orbital station that overlooked a swirling nebula. It was beautiful, in a way, but also intimidating, a reminder of how far she was from home. Kaela's first days were a blur of tests, drills, and endless lectures. The other cadets eyed her with suspicion, their whispers trailing behind her like shadows. They came from wealthy core worlds, their families well-connected and their futures assured. To them, Kaela was an anomaly, a scrawny girl from a backwater colony who had no business being there. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the work, but the isolation gnawed at her. The real challenge, however, came in the form of Instructor Draven, a veteran pilot with a reputation for being ruthless. Draven was the kind of man who could silence a room with a single glance. His face was a patchwork of scars, each one a testament to battles fought and survived. He had no patience for weakness, and he made it clear from the start that he expected Kaela to fail. "You think you're special, Veyra," he barked during her first flight simulation. "You think the stars care about your dreams. Out here, you're nothing but a speck of dust. And dust gets swept away." Kaela clenched her jaw and focused on the controls, her hands moving with practiced precision. But Draven wasn't done. He pushed her harder than the others, throwing her into scenarios designed to break her. Engine failures, asteroid collisions, enemy ambushes. Each simulation was more brutal than the last. And each time, Kaela fought back, her determination hardening like tempered steel. But it wasn't just Draven who stood in her way. The Academy itself seemed designed to test her limits. The coursework was grueling, the physical training relentless. She spent hours in the zero-gravity chamber, her body aching as she practiced maneuvers that left her dizzy and disoriented. She pored over star charts and navigation algorithms late into the night, her eyes burning with exhaustion. And through it all, the other cadets watched, their disdain growing with every stumble. One night, after a particularly grueling day, Kaela found herself alone in the simulator room. She had failed another test, a simple docking maneuver that should have been easy. But her hands had trembled, her focus shattered by the weight of everything bearing down on her. She sat in the pilot's seat, staring at the blank screen, her chest tight with frustration. "You're not going to get any better by sitting there." Kaela turned to see a boy leaning against the doorway. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face. His name was Jackson, and he was one of the few cadets who hadn't treated her with outright hostility. But he wasn't exactly friendly either. "What do you care?" Kaela snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. Jackson shrugged and stepped into the room. "I don't. But if you're going to be here, you might as well not embarrass yourself. And the rest of us, by extension." Kaela glared at him, but there was no malice in his words, just a blunt honesty that she couldn't quite hate. "I don't need your help," she muttered. "Good," Jackson said, sliding into the co-pilot's seat. Because I'm not offering. But if you're going to keep crashing into space stations, someone's going to have to clean up the mess. Might as well be me. Against her better judgment, Kaela found herself smiling. It was the first real smile she had in weeks. The challenges didn't stop, but Kaela began to find her footing. She threw herself into her training with a ferocity that surprised even Draven. She spent every spare moment in the simulators, pushing herself to the brink of exhaustion. She studied the other cadets, learning from their mistakes and their successes. And slowly, she began to improve. But the Academy wasn't just a place of physical and mental trials. It was also a place of secrets. Kaela began to notice things. The way Draven's gaze lingered on her during drills, as if waiting for her to slip up. The whispered conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. The strange, coded messages she sometimes overheard in the comms room. There was something going on, something no one was telling her. One night, while sneaking back to her quarters after a late training session, Kaela overheard a conversation that sent a chill down her spine. Two instructors were speaking in hushed tones, their voices barely audible over the hum of the station systems. "Can't keep her here much longer," one of them said. "Draven's pushing her too hard. If she cracks..." "She won't crack," the other interrupted. "She's stronger than she looks. And we need her." Kaela's heart raced. What did they mean they needed her? And why was Draven pushing her so hard? She wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but she knew better. Instead, she slipped away, her mind racing with questions. The final test came without warning. It was a live exercise, a simulated rescue mission in the heart of the nebula. The cadets were divided into teams, each tasked with retrieving a stranded vessel while navigating the nebula's treacherous currents. Kaela was paired with Jackson and two others, a girl named Lyra and a boy named Tarek. They were given a small, agile ship and sent on their way. At first, everything went smoothly. Kaela piloted the ship with confidence, her hands steady on the controls. But as they approached the stranded vessel, the nebula's interference grew stronger, scrambling their sensors and distorting their view. Then, without warning, the ship's engines failed. "What's going on?" Lyra demanded, her voice panicked. "I don't know," Kaela replied, her hands flying over the controls. "The systems are..." Before she could finish, the ship was rocked by a massive impact. Alarms blared and the lights flickered. Kaela's heart pounded as she struggled to regain control, but it was no use. The ship was spinning out of control, hurtling toward the nebula's core. "We're going to die," Tarek shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Shut up," Jackson snapped. "Kaela, do something." Kaela's mind raced. She had to think, had to find a way out. But the ship was falling apart around them, and the nebula's currents were pulling them in. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and did the only thing she could think of. She shut off the engines. The ship went silent, the alarms cutting out abruptly. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing, ragged and uneven. Then, slowly, the ship stabilized, the nebula's currents carrying them forward. What did you do?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling. Kaela opened her eyes and smiled faintly. "I stopped fighting it. Sometimes, you have to let go to survive." The stranded vessel was just ahead, its lights flickering weakly. Kaela guided their ship alongside it, her movements calm and deliberate. When they finally docked, the others stared at her in awe. "You're insane," Jackson said, but there was a hint of admiration in his voice. Kaela didn't respond. She was too busy thinking about what had just happened, and what it meant for the challenges still to come. The nebula had been a test, but it was only the beginning. Kaela could feel it in the air, a tension that crackled like static, a sense that something was coming. The Academy's corridors, once filled with the hum of routine, now seemed to pulse with an undercurrent of unease. The instructors were quieter, their eyes sharper, their movements more deliberate. Even Draven, who had always been a storm of intensity, seemed to carry a new weight in his silence. Kaela didn't know what was happening, but she knew it involved her. The whispers had grown louder, the sidelong glances more frequent. She had tried to piece it together, to make sense of the fragments she'd overheard, but the truth remained just out of reach. All she knew was that she had to be ready for whatever was coming. The call came in the dead of night, a sharp chime that jolted her awake. Her datapad glowed with a single message: report to Hangar Bay 7. Immediate deployment. She dressed quickly, her hands trembling as she pulled on her flight suit. The hangar was deserted when she arrived, the only sound the low hum of the ship's engines. It was a small vessel, sleek and angular, with a design she didn't recognize. Draven stood beside it, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. "You're late," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. Kaela didn't respond. She didn't trust herself to speak. Instead, she climbed into the pilot's seat, her hands moving automatically over the controls. The ship's systems came to life with a soft whir, the holographic displays casting a pale blue light across her face. Draven slid into the co-pilot's seat, his movements deliberate. "This isn't a simulation," he said, his tone grim. "There's a Federation cruiser in distress. It's carrying classified cargo, and it's under attack. Your job is to get us there, retrieve the cargo, and bring it back. No mistakes." Kaela nodded, her heart pounding. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The look in Draven's eyes told her everything she needed to know. This was the real thing. This was what she had been training for. The ship launched smoothly, the thrusters roaring as they broke through the station's atmosphere. Kaela's hands were steady on the controls, her focus absolute. The stars stretched out before her, endless and infinite, and for a moment she felt a flicker of the old wonder, the old dream. But there was no time for that now. The cruiser was ahead, its hull glowing faintly against the darkness of space. As they approached, the scope of the situation became clear. The cruiser was under heavy fire, its shields flickering as enemy ships swarmed around it. Kaela's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen anything like it, the chaos, the violence, the sheer scale of it. But there was no time to hesitate. "Take us in," Draven said, his voice calm but urgent. "Stay low. Avoid their sensors." Kaela nodded, her hands moving with precision. She guided the ship through the chaos, weaving between bursts of laser fire and debris. The cruiser loomed ahead, its docking bay open and waiting. But as they approached, an enemy ship appeared out of nowhere, its weapons locked on them. Evasive maneuvers. Draven barked. Kaela reacted instantly, her instincts taking over. She spun the ship sharply, the G-forces pressing her into her seat. The enemy's shots missed by inches, their impact shaking the ship. Kaela gritted her teeth and pushed the engines to their limit, her hands flying over the controls. "We're not going to make it," Draven shouted. "Yes, we are," Kaela said, her voice steady. She angled the ship sharply, using the cruiser's hull as cover. The enemy ship overshot, its momentum carrying it past them. Kaela didn't hesitate. She guided the ship into the docking bay, her movements smooth and controlled. The bay doors closed behind them, and the ship came to a halt. For a moment, there was silence. Then Draven turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Not bad," he said, his voice low. "But we're not done yet." The cargo was a small, unassuming crate, its surface etched with strange symbols. Draven carried it carefully, his movements deliberate. Kaela followed him through the cruiser's corridors, her senses on high alert. The ship was eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of its failing systems. They reached the bridge, and Kaela's breath caught in her throat. The crew was gone, the consoles dark and lifeless. But in the center of the room, standing amidst the wreckage, was a figure, a man in a Federation uniform, his face pale and drawn. "You're too late," he said, his voice hollow. "They've already taken it." Draven's expression darkened. "What are you talking about?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. Kaela rushed to his side, but it was too late. He was gone. Draven cursed under his breath and turned to Kaela. "We need to go. Now." They made their way back to the ship, the crate clutched tightly in Draven's arms. But as they reached the docking bay, the enemy ships returned, their weapons trained on them. "Get us out of here," Draven said, his voice tight. Kaela didn't need to be told twice. She guided the ship out of the bay, her hands moving with practiced precision. The enemy ships closed in, their weapons firing relentlessly. Kaela's heart pounded as she dodged their attacks, her focus absolute. But then, without warning, the ship's systems began to fail. The lights flickered, the controls grew sluggish. Kaela's hands flew over the console, trying to stabilize the ship, but it was no use. "We're losing power," she shouted. Draven's expression was grim. "We need to make the jump to hyperspace. Now." Kaela nodded, her hands moving quickly. She input the coordinates, her heart racing. The enemy ships were closing in, their weapons charging. "Hurry," Draven urged. Kaela's finger hovered over the button. She took a deep breath and pressed it. The ship lurched violently, the stars blurring into streaks of light. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the ship emerged from hyperspace, the stars steady and calm. Kaela let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. They had made it. Back at the academy, the crate was handed over to a team of scientists, their faces grim and focused. Kaela watched as they carried it away, her mind racing with questions. But Draven didn't offer any answers. Instead, he turned to her, his expression unreadable. "You did well," he said, his voice low. "But this isn't over. The stars have a way of testing us, and you've only just begun." Kaela nodded, her heart still pounding. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was ready. The stars had called her, and she had answered. And no matter what came next, she would face it head on. As she walked away, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, their light guiding her toward a future she had only just begun to imagine.